Hello, class. Today we'll be reading section 2 in chapter 15, Trouble in Kansas. If you were there, you lived on a New England farm in 1855. You often think about moving west, but the last few harvests have been bad and you can't afford it. Now the Immigrant Aid Society offers to help you get to Kansas, to bring anti-slavery voters like you. They will give you a wagon, livestock, and farm machines. Still, you know that Kansas might be dangerous. Would you decide to risk settling in Kansas? Building background. The argument over the extension of slavery grew stronger and more bitter. It dominated American politics in the mid 1800s. Laws that tried to find compromises ended by causing more violence. The bloodiest battleground of this period was Kansas. The election of 1852. So 1852 is about 8 years before President Lincoln would be elected president of the United States, and the Civil War would erupt in 1861. Four leading candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination emerged in 1852. It became clear that none of them would win a majority of votes. Frustrated delegates at the Democratic National Convention turned to Franklin Pierce, a little-known politician from New Hampshire. Pierce promised to honor the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. Therefore, Southerners trusted Pierce on the issue of slavery. The opposing Whigs also held their convention in 1852. In other presidential elections, they had nominated well-known former generals such as William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor. This had been a good strategy as both men had won. The Whigs decided to choose another war hero. They passed over the current president, Millard Fillmore, because they believed his strict enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act would cost votes. Instead, they chose Winfield Scott, a Mexican war hero. Southerners did not trust Scott, however, because he had not fully supported the Compromise of 1850. Pierce won the election of 1852 by a large margin. So Pierce is going to be one of those presidents that you go through the line and you go, well, what did he do? He was a guy that fit in with the time, and he was a military leader at one point, and he won the election because nobody else could get enough votes. Many Whigs viewed the election as a painful defeat, not just for their candidate, but for their party. Page 484 still, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In his inaugural address, President Pierce expressed his hope that the slavery issue had been put to rest and that no sectional excitement may again threaten the durability of our institution. Sectionalism means one area of the country believes one thing, like the North believed that slavery should end, and in the South, the people believed that slavery should continue. So that no sectional excitement may again threaten the stability of our institutions. Less than a year later, however, a proposal to build a railroad across the West helped revive slavery controversy and open a new period of sectional conflict. Douglas and the railroad. Ever since entering Congress in the mid-1840s, Stephen Douglas had supported the idea of building a railroad to the Pacific Ocean. Douglas favored a line running from Chicago. The first step building such a railroad would be organizing what remained of the Louisiana Purchase into federal territory. The Missouri Compromise required that this land be free territory and eventually free states. Southerners in Congress did not support Douglas's plan, recommending a southern route for their railroad. They preferred the line that ran from New Orleans across Texas, New Mexico territory to Southern California. Determined to have the railroad start in Chicago, Douglas asked a few key Southern senators to support his plan. They agreed to do so if the new territory west of the Missouri was opened up for slavery. So here we have a bunch of new states, people moving west, and slave states wanted people to be able to have slaves there. Therefore, their voice in Congress would be strong, and non-slave states wanted no slavery in the West, so their voice in Congress would be strong. So now we're starting to separate the rest of the country into possibly free and slave states, which would be a problem. Two new territories. In January of 1854, Douglas introduced what became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is on page 485. A plan that would divide the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and all the people in each territory to decide the question of slavery. The act would eliminate the Missouri Compromise's restriction on slavery north of the 36-degree 30 line. Anti-slavery Northerners were outraged by the implications. Some believed the proposal was part of a terrible plot to turn free territory into a dreary region, inhabited by masters and slaves. All across the North, citizens attended protest meetings and sent anti-Nebraska petitions to Congress. Even so, with strong Southern support and with Douglas and President Pierce pressuring their fellow Democrats to vote for it, the measure passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law on May 30th, 1854. Lost amid all the controversy of the territorial bill was Douglas's proposed railroad to the Pacific Ocean. Congress would not approve construction of such a railroad until 1862. Kansas divided. Anti-slavery and pro-slavery groups rushed their supporters to Kansas. One of the people who spoke out strongly against slavery in Kansas was Senator Seward. Gentlemen of slave states, I accept your challenge in the cause of freedom. We will engage the competition for Kansas, and God give me the victory on which side is stronger and in numbers and as it is right. That was from William Henry Seward. Elections for the Kansas territorial legislation were held in March of 1855. Almost 5,000 pro-slavery voters crossed the border from Missouri and voted in Kansas and then returned home. As a result, new legislature had a huge pro-slavery majority. The members of the legislature passed strict laws that made it a crime to question slaveholders' rights and said those who helped fugitive slaves could be put to death. In protest, anti-slavery Kansas formed their own legislature 25 miles away in Topeka. President Pierce, however, only recognized the pro-slavery legislature. So that's kind of crazy. Hey, we don't like the government, so now we're going to create our own government. Even crazier than that is people from Nebraska voted in Kansas, which we know isn't legal. So that'd be like people in Wisconsin coming over to Minnesota to control what ideas are being put forth in their legislature. We don't want people from Wisconsin voting in Minnesota, and we don't want people from Minnesota voting in Wisconsin. The members of the legislature passed strict laws that made it a crime. Oh, I already read that. In protest, the anti-slavery formed their own legislature. Bleeding Kansas. That doesn't sound good, does it? By 1856, Kansas had two opposing governments. The population was angry. Settlers had moved to Kansas to homestead in peace, but the controversy over slavery began to affect everyone. Look at the picture there on 486, Bleeding Kansas. Abolitionists and pro-slavery forces clashed in Kansas, killing many people. Shown here is a group of abolitionists who took the law into their own hands to free one of the group from prison. All right, in April of 1856, a congressional committee arrived in Kansas to decide which government was legitimate. Although committee members declared the election of the pro-slavery legislator to be unfair, the Federalist government did not agree. Attack on Lawrence. The new pro-slavery settlers owned guns, and anti-slavery settlers received weapons from shipments from friends in the East. Then violence broke out. In May of 1856, a pro-slavery grand jury in Kansas charged leaders of the anti-slavery movement with treason. About 800 men rode to the city of Lawrence to arrest anti-slavery leaders, but they fled. The posse took its anger out on Lawrence by setting fires, looting buildings, destroying presses used to print anti-slavery newspaper. One man was killed in the pro-slavery attack that became known as the Sack of Lawrence. Now, an interesting man comes around. His name is John Brown. John Brown is going to be a very violent anti-slavery abolitionist who would go on to later attack United States federal military compound out in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown is said to have really triggered the actual violence that went on between the North and the South in the war. He was really an instigator for starting the war. John Brown's response. This is on page 486. Abolitionist John Brown was from New England, but he and some of his sons had moved to Kansas in 1855. The sack of Lawrence made him determined to fight fire with fire and strike terror in the hearts of pro-slavery people. On the night of May 24, 1856, along Pottawatomie Creek, Brown and his men killed 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas in what became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Brown and his men dragged the pro-slavery men out of their cabins and killed them with swords. The abolitionist band managed to escape capture. Brown declared that his actions had been ordered by God. Kansas collapsed into a civil war and about 200 people were killed. The events of Bleeding Kansas became a national front-page story in September of 1856. A new territorial governor arrived and began to restore order. Brooks attacks Sumner. Congress also reacted to the violence of the sack of Lawrence. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts criticized pro-slavery people in Kansas and personally insulted Andrew Pickens Butler, a pro-slavery senator from South Carolina. Representative Preston Brooks, a relative of Butler's, responded strongly. On May 22nd, 1856, Brooks used a walking cane to beat Sumner unconscious in the Senate chamber. Dozens of Southerners sent Brooks new canes, but Northerners were outraged and called the attacker Bully Brooks. Brooks had only to pay a $300 fine in the federal court. It took Sumner 3 years before he was well enough to return to the Senate. Summary and preview: the Kansas-Nebraska Act produced a national uproar. In the next section, you'll read about divisions in political parties. So that's how a lot of tension started building in areas of the country that had not been settled yet. People were moving westward so they could get new land, and slave states wanted people to be able to have slavery there. Free states wanted those states to be free and not have slavery. This caused a greater tension in the country, which would eventually lead to the Civil War. Thank you. Have a great day.